Okay, so I'm pretty far behind on this video series, so this is part 2 of our Gameolgy series on video game analysis. Be sure you check out part 1 before you watch this video. So last time we talked about how to really judge a story in a video game and how it really depends on the game in question. Some games really focus on story and therefore you judge it like you would a book, movie, or TV show. Some games it's really just there for the purpose of context, but either way it is important in some respect. And now we're going to move into presentation, and of all the different aspects that go into analyzing a video game, whether or not it's good or bad, I feel like presentation is really the big thing that people tend to misjudge or judge improperly. So when you're talking about the presentation of a video game, it comes down to two things specifically. The actual presentation of the game, the graphics, the visuals, stuff like that, and the sound design. And where I feel like people really miss the mark in judging the quality of the presentation is in the graphics themselves. And what I mean by that is that they tend to look at the graphics in a very specific way. They tend to primarily focus on the technology. Like, for example, they would look for the game that has the most realistic or photorealistic graphics. So for the sake of argument, we'll say they'll grade on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being something like The Last of Us, like you see here, and a 1 being something like Pong, something that is as far removed from the cutting edge as you can possibly get. And this is something that is definitely wrong when you're talking about judging the quality of the video game's graphics, because all it's really boiling it down to is whether or not the game has the best technology, and technology is not the end-all be-all when it comes to presentation in a video game. Now, that's not to say that technology isn't important, because in essence, it's essentially like, say, comparing it to a painter, the quality of paint that the artist has to work with. So if you can have like these great big open worlds, like these hyper detailed animations, photorealism, lots of different particle effects and everything, it is still impressive and it is something to be commended. But it's no substitute for actual art design. Just because a game's graphics are on the cutting edge of technology doesn't necessarily mean that the game is going to look good, and it's definitely not how you want to judge the game from a presentation perspective, because the technology is something that is always going to age. For example, there was a time, believe it or not, where Pong was on the cutting edge of technology. When this came out, I have a feeling this was probably the most amazing thing anyone had ever said. The fact that you can have graphics on the screen and you can actually control it one-to-one. That was a big deal when Pong was first introduced. But for a better comparison, let's compare some of the Medal of Honor games. So this is the first Medal of Honor released on the PlayStation, and at the time, this was as realistic as a game could get, at least as far as console games go, with all the detail, the animation, stuff like that. Again, this was on the cutting edge for when Medal of Honor came out, but as soon as the next generation Medal of Honor came out, the game suddenly became dated, and that's because the Medal of Honor games were primarily relying on the technology and just trying to depict realism. So no matter what they would have done, it would have looked dated as soon as the next batch of console games come out. Now let's look at something that's actually older than Medal of Honor, and that is the original Doom. Now, I remember one of my teachers who isn't as well versed in video games watching one of my videos and laughing at the older games in regards to the technology on display. But the thing about something like Doom is it still holds up from a visual standpoint despite the fact that it's made on such dated technology, and that's because a lot of time and effort was put into how the game would actually look, the artistry of the games. So everyone knows all the character models, the weapons, and even some of the levels too, you still look at Doom and you say, Doom, the game has stood the test of time in regards to its visuals, even though it's made with Stone Age technology by today's standards. Another game that has really stood the test of time is something like Team Fortress. Team Fortress, Valve worked really hard to give Team Fortress a very timeless art style with the angular character models, the cartoony proportions of everything, and even the levels. It's all stylized to look like a 3D comic book, something like The Incredibles, for instance. And because of that, even though Team Fortress 2 is almost 2 decades old at this point, the game still looks good, and that's because they focused on the art design, and that was a really smart move on Valve's part because they wanted Half-Life to stick around for a while. It's one of the few examples of a live service game actually working. So, yeah, I would say that art design is more important than the actual technology. And one of my favorite examples of this is actually comparing games that came out on the Wii versus something that came out on the PS3 or Xbox 360. The PS3 and Xbox 360, they were big into the hyper-realistic games for the time. And while there are definitely plenty of games on the PS3 and Xbox 360 that look incredible, the more memorable games, visually speaking, were actually on the Wii, of all things. You had games that were creative during development, like Mario Galaxy or Metroid Prime 3, or you had games that went for ultra stylization, like Mad World here, with its black and white graphics with a small splash of color, imitating something along the lines of Sin City. So again, even though a lot of people criticize the Wii for being a generation behind the curve compared to the other consoles, developers were still able to make some damn good-looking games for the thing, and that's because they focused on the art style. So yeah, art design is always going to trump hardware limitations. Now, that's not to say that going for stylization is always the best choice, because, you know, people do like realism in games, but the trick is to try to combine it. So part of the reason the Uncharted games hold up so well visually is because while it does depict a realistic setting, there is a lot of exaggeration to it. They exaggerate certain color choices. They really lean into the culture that Nathan Drake finds himself making his way through. It gives every game in the series a distinct visual style to it, which is, again, very important, because if you look at a game, even in a long-running series like Uncharted, and you're able to discern which game it is just based on the graphics, then you know you've done your job. And this is something that still holds true today with Astrobot, for example. This game, yeah, it's not as... A lot of people are probably going to say it's not as visually impressive as, like, The Last of Us Part 2, the Until Dawn remake, or maybe even Concord to some degree. But whereas those games are going to age out in regards to technology, 10 years later, people are still going to be talking about how beautiful Astrobot is, and that's because they work really hard on the art design with color choices and, you know, really playing with the technology of the PlayStation 5 instead of just shooting for hyper-realism. It's just, again, art design taking priority over the technology. So that's how you need to look at graphics when you're talking about a video game. But what about sound design? Well, in regards to sound design, the first thing a lot of people tend to think of is music. And rightfully so, because, like, just about every video game, it tends to pair the gameplay with some kind of music. But music is subjective. So, for example, my preference for music is rock and roll, heavy metal, something like that. But I wouldn't say that every video game needs to have a heavy metal or rock and roll soundtrack. While I would definitely like that, some different types of music just work better for certain games. For example, a heavy metal soundtrack fits something like Brutal Legend like a glove, and while it probably would fit something like Mad World like a glove as well, the soundtrack Mad World has, which is very jazzy, urban, hip-hop, rap, something like that, it also fits really well. So yeah, like for me, what really matters when you're looking at the soundtrack of a game is the music, for one, catchy, or more importantly, does it fit the action on screen? If it fits the action on screen, I don't care what kind of genre of music is. If it fits, it fits. And it can even be used to enhance the experience a great deal too. So here's one of my favorite examples from Mario Galaxy. So this is when you enter the first level in the game. Yes! So as soon as you start the game, Mario's feet hitting the ground in the level and the music fading in, it's almost like the sound of a gunshot going off to start like a marathon or something. It's basically the game saying go in a very subtle manner, and it's really satisfying. That also applies to sound effects as well. Sound effects, or sound design in general, can really enhance any gameplay experience as well. For argument, let's take a look at two games that were released roughly around the same time, Half-Life 2 and Doom 3, and compare the submachine guns in the game. So listen to how the submachine gun sounds in Half-Life. Now that sounds really crunchy, doesn't it? Now let's compare that to Doom 3's submachine gun. Now that probably didn't sound anywhere near as satisfying as the one in Half-Life did, and that kind of sound design for an FPS, I would say, is very important, because if the guns sound really good, that's just going to enhance the feeling of actually mowing down enemies. It gives you a nice sense of empowerment. You pair that with the graphics on screen, like you shoot at an enemy and you see them get staggered backwards, the blood just shoot out of them. It just really makes you feel like every time you pull that trigger, you're just raining hell down upon your enemy. It's great. It's also really cool when games are able to combine these different aspects together. One of my favorite examples of this, combining the music and sound effects together to create a really strong atmosphere, is in Metroid Fusion. Look at this. See, like just the combination of that ominous drone and the metallic footsteps of the SAX, it makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up every time that thing appears on screen, because you just know if that thing sees you, it's going to kill you. It's fantastic. Some games really do lean into really complex sound design. They'll even incorporate it into the gameplay to some degree. The best sound design in any video game I can think of would probably have to be the Thief series, and that's primarily because the sound design is just so detailed in the game. It's directional. How far away the enemies are is vital. You make different sound effects depending on what you're walking on. And it's just so detailed. You can even press your character up against a wall or a door, and you can actually hear what's on the other side of it, and that can give you a good idea of where everything on the other side of that door is. And all of that is important to the gameplay of Thief as well. I just can't think of any other game that really does that. So those are some important aspects of sound design that you need to look at. But there is one more aspect of sound design that is a little hard to judge, and that is typically the voice acting. And as crude an analogy as it is, good sound design versus bad sound design, it's kind of like judging if something is pornography or not.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Very.
Sometimes you just know it when you see it. But yeah, that's typically how I would look at judging the presentation of a game. Really looking at, not just the technology of it all, but also the art design that's at work and all the different aspects of the sound design and how that's used to really craft this deep and detailed game world. But yeah, that's going to do it for presentation. So tune in next time, and we're actually going to get into what a lot of people would argue is the most important aspect of any video game, and that's the gameplay. I'll see you guys then.